Thank you for coming. We are going to have a discussion. It just hasn't started yet, so we are going to have a number of wonderful speakers first, and then we're going to have a discussion, and hopefully there are going to be people joining us as other slow-running sessions end and other panelists find where we are. We are expecting to have Tammy Belinsky, who's here, and Lynn Stewart, who's here, and Kevin Zeese, who's here, and if anyone should spot William Woodward or Jesse Johnson, point them to the front of the room, please. And my name's David Swanson, and I've been assigned to both moderate and keynote, which is dangerous because I may never shut up, but I'm going to try to make this speech go fast and hopefully make it useful. Our First Amendment has been locked up in a chain-link free speech zone. The Fourth Amendment is under warrantless surveillance and scared for its life. The Fifth, Sixth, and Seventh Amendments have been detained without charge. And the Eighth Amendment is presently undergoing a waterboarding. We are losing our original Bill of Rights, as well as basic rights that underpin it, including the right of habeas corpus, that is the right not to be simply kidnapped and imprisoned or disappeared without a fair trial, the right to vote and have our votes credibly counted, the right to live in a nation of laws where the laws are publicly known and everyone is required to obey the same laws, the right to live free of military occupation, which is the spirit of the Third Amendment and of the Declaration of Independence, the right to have our views represented in the House of Representatives, and the all-important democracy-maintaining, tyranny-preventing right of impeachment. Of Franklin Roosevelt's 4 freedoms, we are making progress in exactly 0 of 4. The first 2 freedoms of speech and religion are found in our First Amendment, which is locked up in a free speech zone waiting for the war on Christmas to be over. The third freedom, the freedom from want, is slipping from the grasp of even the vision of billions of people. Roosevelt meant for everyone, not just Americans, to have this freedom. Even many Americans do not have it. If they had it, they would be better participants in our civic life and would help to win and protect many of the other freedoms. The current U.S. government has made the obliteration of the fourth freedom its primary mission for a similar reason. If we had the fourth freedom, we would be much better prepared to safeguard the others. The fourth freedom is the freedom from fear. Roosevelt proposed winning this freedom not by establishing the other freedoms around the globe, but also by reducing armaments around the globe. Today, we carry the dual obligation to increase armaments in our militarized attempt to combat fear and to nonetheless remain constantly afraid. As well we should, because the increased armaments are giving us reason to. It is safe to say that if the evildoers hated us for our freedoms, they'd be well on the way to loving us by now. If we were to find a way of restoring our rights and liberties and developing new ones, it would be a positive and constructive step, even if the method of restoration included holding accountable the people who have been stripping our rights away. Such a restoration would have as its main purpose something much larger than personal revenge or punishment. It would be forward-looking, not backward-looking. When Senator Chris Dodd proposed to filibuster any bill granting telecom corporations immunity for crimes that violated our Fourth Amendment, he made himself something of a founding father of our country. This is a nation that has had to be founded again and again and again. As it has been for 230 years, we've just slipped up the past several years and stopped founding it. Of course, in the end, Senator Reid used the Fourth Amendment for toilet paper, but the House found a little bit of spine and chose not to completely flush it down the drain just yet. With various degrees of complicity from Congress, from potential whistleblowers who have kept silent, from corporations, from the corporate media, from other nations, from AstroTurf pseudo-activist groups, and from the rest of us who have simply not done enough to put a stop to it, Here are a few of the things the Cheney-Bush regime has done to our rights and liberties. They have illegally detained indefinitely and without charge U.S. citizens and foreign captives. February 7th, 2002, the President signed an order announcing that none of the provisions of Geneva apply. He was already then transporting captives from a war in Afghanistan, and most of them from outside of Afghanistan, to captivity in Afghanistan and in Guantanamo. He had already begun rounding up Muslim non-citizens in the United States and detaining terrorism suspects around the world. Many of these detainees have been beaten and tortured, as documented in photographs, witness testimony, documents exposed in lawsuits, and a Justice Department Inspector General report. And detainees have been ghosted. That is to say that the Cheney-Bush administration has refused to provide the identities of detainees or the locations of detention centers, and has refused to allow the Red Cross to visit them. U.S. citizens have been held in military brigs in solitary confinement for as long as 3 years. Bush has declared people enemy combatants subject to the death penalty without the right to counsel or fair trial. The Military Commissions Act purports to legalize this power. The Cheney-Bush gang has secretly authorized and encouraged the use of torture, and Bush has recently confessed to approving of meetings at which Cheney and others approved of particular torture sessions. Nancy Pelosi and others in Congress were briefed on waterboarding and other torture techniques in 2002 and kept quiet. The one Congresswoman who formally but secretly objected was denied the chairmanship of a committee on which she was the ranking member by Nancy Pelosi. Torture has been routinely used at Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib, in Iraq, air bases in Afghanistan, secret sites, and nations to which we have renditioned prisoners to be tortured. It has included waterboarding, beatings, faked executions, confinement in extreme cold, in extreme heat, prolonged enforcement of painful stress positions, sleep deprivation, sexual humiliation, defilement of religious articles, suspension from the ceiling by wrists, electric shock, slicing of genitals with knives, and I could go on for quite a while. It has involved everything up to and including murder. The guards at Guantanamo are terrifying. Even a man with no legs, amputated after being intentionally exposed to extreme cold by American guards in Afghanistan, is treated as a horrifying threat. Here's a quote, and then I'll tell you who it's from. The bandages wrapped around Abdul's stumps were never changed. When he took them off himself, they were full of blood and pus. He showed the bandage to the guards and pointed to his open wounds. The guards ignored him. Later I saw how he tried to wash the bandages in his bucket of drinking water, but he could hardly move his hands, so he wasn't able to. And even if he had, where would he have hung them up to dry? He wasn't allowed to touch the fence. He wrapped his stumps back up in the dirty bandages. When the guards came to take him to be interrogated, they ordered him to sit with his back to the door and put his hands on his head. When they opened the door, they stormed in as they did with every other prisoner. They hit him on the back and pushed him to the ground. Then they handcuffed and bound him so he could no longer move. Abdul howled in pain. End quote. A man with no legs. No, a terrorist with no legs. A mythical, evil-doing creature with no legs. Hatred, yes. Bigotry, yes. But driven by fear instilled through training in the U.S. military. Fear of monsters with superhuman powers. Fear strong enough to make a team of armored stormtroopers fear a legless man in a cage. The passage I quoted is from 5 Years of My Life, An Innocent Man in Guantanamo by Murat Kurnaz. And reading his account might begin to make the reader, too, view the caged prisoners as less than human, were it not for the skillful way in which Kurnaz intersperses descriptions of his pre-Guantanamo life in Germany. Kurnaz made the mistake of traveling from Germany to Pakistan shortly after September 11th. He has never been to Afghanistan except in the custody of American guards who took him there on the way to Cuba. The Americans never alleged any crime, but simply declared him an enemy combatant and took away 5 years of his life. A kangaroo court commission convicted him on 2 counts. The first was having once been friends with a man who supposedly committed a suicide bombing long after Kurnaz was already in Guantanamo, and about which Kurnaz knew nothing. The strangest part about this first count is that the alleged suicide bomber is alive and well in Germany. has never been involved in anything of the sort, and has not himself been charged with anything. The second count was of having accepted free food from a humanitarian group with which Kurnaz was working in Pakistan. How that act made Kurnaz the worst of the worst is not clear. While the United States always knew that they'd paid $3,000 to someone for Kurnaz in Pakistan on the basis of no suspicion of anything, the tribunal concluded that he'd been arrested as an al-Qaeda fighter in Afghanistan. At least that was the conclusion up until the moment the United States set him free, or the moment 3 years earlier when the United States decided he was innocent but allowed him to be tortured daily for 3 more years. At Kandahar Air Base in Afghanistan, Kurnaz was deprived of food and sleep, routinely beaten, electroshocked through his feet, threatened with drowning and his head held underwater and punched in the stomach, and hung from the ceiling by his wrists until he lost consciousness. Kurnaz was in very good physical shape prior to this ordeal and survived it. He saw others die from these procedures. Kurnaz did not know at the time that the worst still lay ahead for him on a Caribbean island, and he had no idea where he was being taken when they loaded him on the plane. Quote, "They chained us together and herded us onto a plane. We were bound so tightly we couldn't move a millimeter. Again, I thought they were taking us to an American military base in Turkey. What else was I supposed to think? Sleep would have been the only consolation, but the soldiers kept hitting us to keep us awake. I thought about the American movies I'd seen in Bremen, action flicks and war movies. I used to admire the Americans. Now I was getting to know their true nature. I say this without anger. It's simply the truth as I saw and experienced it. I don't want to insult anyone, and I'm not talking about all Americans. But the ones I encountered are terrified of pain. They're afraid of every little scratch, bacteria, and illness. They're like little girls, I'd say. If you examine Americans closely, you realize this, no matter how big or powerful they are. But in movies, they're always the heroes." End quote. Brought to the New World in a transport reminiscent of slave ships, Kurnaz was placed in a small metal cage 6 foot by 7, exposed to the sun, rain, spiders, snakes, and soldiers on a lawless military base in Cuba. And he was better off than most of those around him. Quote, "I know of a prisoner," he wrote, "who complained of a toothache. He was brought to a dentist who pulled out his healthy teeth as well as his rotten one. I knew a man from Morocco who used to be a ship captain. He couldn't move one of his little fingers because of frostbite. The rest of his fingers were all right. They told him they would amputate the little finger. They brought him to the doctor, and when he came back, he had no fingers left. They had amputated everything but the thumbs." End quote. Even in Cuba, one of the torture techniques employed is subjection to extreme cold inside a chilled metal box. Kurnaz provides us an inside account of these experiences and of the day-to-day life of solitary confinement, beatings, interrogations, and denial of adequate nutrition. Kurnaz was once kept awake for 3 weeks. He was given extensive stays in solitary. He was subjected to extremes of cold and heat. He was denied oxygen almost to the point of suffocation. When guards trampled a Koran, the prisoners began a hunger strike and discovered that the general in charge did not want them to die. They discovered that they had some power and they got organized. In the end, Kurnaz and others were force-fed, and the commander of Guantanamo was replaced with another, General Jeffrey Miller, who seemed not to care at all who lived or died. Prisoners once mixed feces and water and threw it on Miller's face, and from that point on they called him Mr. Toilet. In this environment, Kurnaz found humanity among the prisoners, who shared the little food they were given and cared for each other, and in very rare instances he found humanity in a couple of guards who spoke of their disagreement with what they were engaged in. One can only hope that every man and woman who has served as a guard at Guantanamo reads his book and adds their voice to the growing chorus speaking truth to unspeakable power. In Guantanamo, prisoners are sometimes told they are being released, given clothes, placed on an airplane, and then thrown back in their cages. So Kurnaz was inclined to be skeptical when told of his impending release. "I was brought," he wrote, "to an interrogation room and chained to the floor, but no one came to ask me any questions. Hours later, 2 soldiers appeared and placed a telephone on the table. 'You'll be getting a call,' they told me. That made me curious. I didn't know who the caller would be, an interrogator, my lawyer, maybe the judge. More hours passed. What was going on here? Suddenly the phone rang, but no one came to help me. I couldn't pick up the receiver with my hands and feet shackled, but the telephone kept ringing. I threw myself to the floor and tried to drag the table toward me with my feet. Kicking one of the table legs, I managed to dislodge the receiver and knock it down to the floor. I squirmed to get my head as close as possible to the handset. I could just hear a voice on the other end of the line. Hello, hello. Yes, it's me, Bob Hare. You're going to be released. I know, how are you doing? Prout, are you listening? You're going to be released. I know, they're playing a nasty trick on you. How's your daughter doing? Yet he was released, and yet we do not all know his name. For 5 years, our tax dollars paid guards to ask him his name and other basic questions endlessly between meetings, and yet we do not all know his story and feel the shame of it. All across the United States of America, there are university departments that claim to teach philosophy and ethics, others that claim to teach politics, and yet there are not 1 million students and professors in Washington, D.C. every day demanding impeachment and justice. How can this be? Can a German victim of our apathy perhaps shake us out of our good Germanism? On Tuesday of this week, according to a newspaper report from AFP, quote, a handful of U.S. lawmakers gave only half an ear to the testimony of a former detainee at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, who spent nearly 5 years in prison before being released without charge, Murat Kurnaz. The House of Representatives Committee on Foreign Affairs invited Kurnaz to testify via video conference as part of a hearing on Guantanamo detainees who are being considered for release but cannot find a host country to take them. Taking into account the difference in time between the U.S. and Europe, it was already late in Germany by the time Committee Speaker, Democrat Bill Delahunt, gave Kurnaz an opportunity to speak. Kurnaz, his hair trimmed short and dressed in a black suit, gripped his notes and began to speak, but a technical difficulty prevented the audio from reaching Washington. Some reporters and members of the public gave up waiting, but after around a half an hour, Kurnaz was able to be heard, and he recounted some of the horrific details of his travail. I did nothing wrong, and I was treated like a monster, he said, describing acts of torture such as being suspended by his wrists for hours on end, receiving electrical shocks, and enduring simulated drowning. I know others have died from this kind of treatment, he said. I suffered sleep deprivation, solitary confinement, religious and sexual humiliation. I was beaten numerous times. There was no law in Guantanamo. Facing the screen, the majority of seats for committee members sat empty. Barely half a dozen lawmakers came to listen to the former detainee, and most were unable to remember his name, with one even calling him Mr. Karzai. The first to speak after Kurnaz was finished was ranking member on the committee, Republican Congressman Dana Rohrabacher, who expressed doubts about the testimony and recalled that the United States was, quote, at war and needed to protect itself even at the price of making some errors, end quote. Senator John McCain himself claims to be a victim of torture. He was finally released from prison in Vietnam following negotiations, which he now would denounce as appeasement. And torture, which he once denounced as both evil and useless, he now celebrates. In fact, McCain led a successful, if stupid, effort to pointlessly recriminalize torture. Bush signed the bill into law, but added a signing statement written by Cheney's lawyer announcing that he would still torture if he wanted to. McCain's response was the same as it would have been had his head been underwater. Impeachment hearings for Dick Cheney on this topic would destroy any pretense that McCain can legitimately be elected president. If McCain will flip his position on torture, how could there be anything on which he wouldn't sell out? But the Democrats won't do it, perhaps because of the complicity of their own leaders. Senator Barack Obama says he's opposed to impeachment because he is unaware of any crimes having been committed, and he believes impeachment should be reserved for exceptional circumstances. Bush and Cheney authorized torture and admit having done so, and the president holds responsibility as the chief executive for failing to halt torture, either when he became aware of it or when the rest of us did. The only defense put up by the White House is the word game of labeling certain torture techniques as something other than torture. One of the many reasons that this is absurd is that these thugs have made use of just about every torture technique ever developed. They can't all be really not torture. In addition, the Third Geneva Convention, which is the law of this land under Article 6 of our Constitution, doesn't say it's okay to torture if you don't use the worst techniques. It says no physical or mental torture nor any other form of coercion may be inflicted on prisoners of war to secure from them information of any kind whatever. Prisoners of war who refuse to answer may not be threatened, insulted, or exposed to any unpleasant or disadvantageous treatment of any kind. This is, of course, why the Cheney Bolsheviks call prisoners of war enemy combatants, a category of person that does not exist in any system of law. Torture is prohibited by the 8th Amendment of our Constitution, by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, by the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, by the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, and Degrading Treatment or Punishment. Rather than holding anyone responsible for torture, the House of Representatives last week proposed to recriminalize it yet again. The fact is that torture cannot be criminalized because it is, under international law, along with things like genocide, something that no nation can ever legalize. The president of the National Lawyers Guild, Marjorie Cohn, recently testified on this to the House Judiciary Committee, and her organization has proposed that Congress create a special independent prosecutor to prosecute the lawyers who have worked with Bush and Cheney to make torture a tool of the United States. So I've gotten carried away with one topic and focused on torture. Some of our missing civil liberties could be restored through the repeal of legislation, like the Patriot Act, like the Military Commissions Act, etc. But some of these laws, too, were put in place to legalize unconstitutional activities only after those activities were exposed to the public. Meanwhile, those who committed all of these crimes for years, who spied on us without warrant, detained without charge, tortured, murdered, deprived us of transparent elections, and so forth, have paid no penalties. So what is to discourage administrations in the near or distant future from engaging in the same types of abuses? I can't imagine what could do it better than impeachment and or prosecution. Impeachments have been done in one day. We have 8 months. We don't need to touch anything Congress has been complicit in to make our point. They got Al Capone on tax fraud. They can get Dick Cheney on refusing a subpoena. But get him they must. Or the work of Virginians like George Mason and James Madison and the struggles of nameless Americans by the thousands over 2.5 centuries will not just be consigned to history. They will be erased from human memory, which will not permit that history to be written any longer. Your Congressmember is home for the next week and should not have a minute of peace until we have justice. Thank you. We didn't discuss order, so I'll go in order from near to far, and if there are no objections. Kevin Zeese was on the previous panel along with me. For those of you who were here the previous 2 hours, he has been a leader for peace and impeachment and justice and economic justice for years. He's led groups like Democracy Rising. He's currently the director of Voters for Peace. Go to votersforpeace.us. Go to truevote.us. Welcome, Kevin Zeese.
So I think we're in the midst right now of living through a counter-revolution. Counter-revolution to the revolution that's now in this country. And it's a revolution that's not started with the George Bush administration. But I can remember when I was graduating from law school in 1980, that you could see the signs of this counter-revolution already going on. You could see the weakening of the Fourth Amendment, right to be free from illegal searches. When I started law school, a police officer had to have some information about the source of information, where the person providing information about an illegal activity. The officer had to know where that came from, the legitimacy of the source. When I graduated from law school, an anonymous tip was enough. An anonymous tip. So imagine Officer Bob calls up Officer Joe and says, "Hey, Joe, Officer Joseph, there's a marijuana smuggler, and he has marijuana in his basement, and he goes to Florida every so often, and you should go search his house. What's your name?" "I can't give you my name." Hangs up. That's enough. That was enough, and that's way before the current administration. The right to bail. When I was in law school, before you started law school, you had a right to bail. And now when I graduated law school, presumption against bail in drug cases, and now in other cases as well, right to bail disappears. When I started law school, an attorney could take legal fees and use those fees to represent a client. When I got out of law school, attorneys could have those fees seized before the trial. In fact, the law firm I worked with in Virginia in the mid-1980s was the first to have its legal fees seized before a trial. So we've been going through this counter-revolution for quite some time. David did a great job of describing the current escalation of that revolution under the Bush administration, but it's not something that's all that new. It's something that's been ongoing. And you can see it, I think, really clearly when you look at the Constitution and look at how our government is functioning. In the Constitution, there's about 14 paragraphs describing the responsibilities, and the powers of Congress. There's about 3 paragraphs on the presidency. And one of those paragraphs is impeachment. So the power was in the Congress, not in the presidency. Yet now, what we live in, an imperial presidency. An imperial presidency is trying to grab more power with signing statements. And down the road, as the Supreme Court evolves, who knows whether that will be upheld or not. It seems to be something that's acceptable. You can also see this change in power and misapplication of the Constitution by looking at one amendment, an amendment that gets ignored. The amendment that Judge Bork called an inkblot, the Ninth Amendment. The Ninth Amendment of the Constitution is an amendment that makes up for the previous 8, only including specific rights. The Ninth Amendment says that the federal government has certain specific powers, everything else reserved to the people. Limited government, maximum individual rights. That's evolved and ignored, and almost never used in litigation in the Ninth Amendment. But that's the amendment that really, I think, raises the question of, for example, on marijuana use. What, in a government of limited powers and maximum individual rights, the government tells you can't consume a substance, you can't affect your consciousness? How free are you if you can't affect your consciousness? How free are you if you can't decide what you put into your body? And yet, based on this drug war that may not even be legal under a constitutional framework, I don't think it is. Under this drug war, we have lost an immense number of rights. And so this loss of rights is something that has evolved and gotten worse. And one of the areas where it's most important, because I think this is the root cause of so many of the problems we face in governance today, is corporate power. Corporate government is what we have. And that has been something that has been protected in the laws. And, whenever we have a Supreme Court nominee, you don't hear them asking questions about which corporations you represent, what do you do for this corporation. Corporate lawyers are fine. In fact, there was an aide to Senator Obama running for president who said that he couldn't imagine Senator Obama appointing someone to the Supreme Court who would challenge corporate power. Well, that is the root issue that needs to be challenged, because what we have today is corporations have greater power than people. Why don't we have campaign finance reform? Because we have to allow that money in as free speech. Where does that money come from? The CEOs, the wealth class, the elites, the corporate power. That money to speak in government is preventing us from having clean campaigns. So we need to have a real revolution in our Constitution. One of the things I love about our Constitution is that it can evolve. That it was imperfect for sure when it was first written, and it's imperfect today. But it includes in it the mechanism for evolution, and we need major evolution. We need evolution that returns power to the people, that puts corporations in place so that they work for us and we don't work for them. We need evolution that really creates a democracy that's representative, because our current democracy certainly is not representative. If you look at what the people want, according to polls, the vast majority wants out of Iraq, not out of Iraq. The vast majority wants single-payer health care. We don't have single-payer health care. On issue after issue, the government does not represent the people, even though we're supposed to be a representative democracy. And there are things we can do to improve our democracy, because our democracy is old. And since the founding of our democracy, there have been many democracies that have come since that are much new and improved. For example, the international requirement is universal voter registration. Not barriers to voter registration as we have in the United States, but universal voter registration. You come of age, you're registered. You know, the United States has a very poor record in voter turnout. We rank 120th out of 172 countries worldwide. That number right there, I think, is a symptom of a democracy that's in serious failure. 120th out of 172 countries in voter turnout. And why don't people turn out? Because the polls of non-voters, the main reason people turn out is because they feel that voting makes no difference. They know that they're choosing between two candidates who really aren't representing them. But we can change that in a real expansion of our Constitution, a real updating of our Constitution to create governments like they have in other parts of the world where they have proportional representation. Right now you have a situation where if you get 50.1%, you're represented, but if you get 49.9%, you're not. And so 4 years or 6 years, Congress or Senate or governorship, wherever election occurs, that 49.9%, that's not part of the discussion anymore. You're out. And so for all those years of legislative discussion, views of minorities are not heard. Views of the large minorities are not heard. So that's why our government can't represent the people. It only represents this majority that happens to win by a sliver. And that 49% doesn't get represented. So we can create a democracy that has more representation. We can create a democracy that frees up voters to vote for what they want rather than based on what they fear. So many of us are put in a situation of voting for what we fear. Hold our nose and vote for the lesser evil. It doesn't have to be that way. You know, around the world they have ranked choice voting, where if there's more than one candidate, many countries often have races with 3, 5 candidates ranked. You rank your top choices. So your first choice is A, second choice is B, and then if A doesn't win, then your votes go to B, if no one gets the majority. So that guarantees two things. It guarantees a majority vote because you keep counting and doing an instant runoff until you get a majority vote. And it guarantees that you get to vote for what you believe in. So let's say it was a 2000 race of Nader, Gore, and Bush. You support Nader, but you're afraid of Bush. You're forced to vote for Gore. In a ranked choice system, you vote Nader and Gore. If no one gets 50%, then your Nader vote goes to Gore. That's your second choice. That's how ranked choice voting works. So there's lots of things we can learn from around the world, but we first have to face up to the reality that we are losing our constitutional rights rapidly. Right now, the direction we're going into is not evolving into a more democratic country, but in fact evolving into a less democratic country. What I fear is that this counter-revolution that I mentioned when I started this talk is nearing completion. We see corporate government. We see the destruction of almost all the amendments to the Constitution, or the weakening of them all. We see things like signing statements. We see the militarization of police, not just abroad, but at home. In 1970, there were no SWAT teams, no paramilitary forces on any U.S. police forces. Now, over 70% of U.S. police forces have paramilitary forces. So we're seeing the militarization of policing at home. So if we don't stop this counter-revolution, the direction we're going in is anti-democratic. It's a military, industrial complex enforced by military power at home. And we're going to see that kind of security state that we fear. And that security state is coming quickly. I just got back from China, and I'll just end with this. And first off, I didn't feel any less free in China than I felt here. It's kind of strange. In fact, the only difference I noticed was when I went to the airport in China, I didn't have to take my shoes off when I got searched. Here I get to take my shoes off. But maybe that China is actually better at it than the United States and more experienced at it. And I was in a town called Shenzhen, which a few years ago was a little fishing village. Now it's 15 million people and 100,000 industries. And they're putting in place in Shenzhen, with the help of U.S. firms, defense contractors, 2 million video cameras in one city, with the ability to do facial recognition, search a database of 10 million people in 1.5 seconds. They're in the process of putting that in place with our help. The Defense Department, with defense contractor help. My governor in Maryland, Governor OMalley, a good Democrat, former mayor of Baltimore, wants to see video cameras from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore to protect us from terrorists. So that's where we're going, folks. It's a counter-revolution. or it's time for a revolution that really brings democracy back to the United States. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. You can speak from there or come up here, Lynn, but our next speaker will be Lynn Stewart, who is a 30-year veteran civil rights and criminal defense lawyer and has recently been, I'm reading off the website, has recently been involved in a case that many of you have heard about, and she is fighting a U.S. government false conviction for work done on behalf of an Islamist client.
I always start out by saying, you know, a lot of people feel, well, we have all this terrible law on the books, and we do, but they're not really rounding anybody up. They're not really sending anybody to jail. Here she is, John Ashcroft's poster child, I call myself sometimes. Because 6 years ago, on a beautiful April morning, we're getting ready to go to court, my husband Ralph and I, in our usual crazy fashion. For some reason this morning he happened to be out ahead of me. And I came down the stairs in our house in Brooklyn, and he was standing on the stoop. Now, for those of you who are not Brooklyn-oriented, a stoop is the set of stairs outside the front door where Brooklynites spend the summer. They don't go to the Hamptons, they sit on the stoop. Ralph was standing on the stoop. And when I got to the door, I heard him speaking, and when I got to the door, I saw arranged in my front yard what I knew immediately to be law enforcement. I mean, you can't be 30 years a criminal defense lawyer and not spot a cop. Something about the shoes or the polyester pants, I don't know what it is, but you know law enforcement when you see it. And then I hear Ralph saying, I don't see a warrant. He said, I don't see a warrant. You know, what's going on here? So I figured, well, I stepped out on the stoop and put a restraining hand on Ralph, and I said, take it easy. I said, we'll have you out by lunchtime. He's a guy who goes to a PTA meeting and gets arrested, you know? I mean, he's the agitator. I'm the lawyer. Well, the FBI pointed up at the stoop and said, we're not here for him, we're here for you. Well, it certainly is a defining moment, as most of you can imagine. Your life sort of passes in front of your eyes, and you think to yourself, have I done anything? Did I do something? What did I do? And I'm happy to say in my own case, and I don't think this was just self-justification or rectification. To me, I said, I've done nothing. I've done absolutely nothing. Why are these people here? Because you knew it was not because you didn't sign the bottom line of your income tax. This was serious. This was 3 or 4 guys in a car and handcuffs and the whole works. So I handed my bag to Ralph so they wouldn't be able to search it. Not that anything was in it, but who needs them to know anything? And I said to him, call Jeffrey, that's my son, who's also a lawyer. I said, and call the press. Because I had a big reputation in New York. I'm one of those lawyers that does all those cases that get in the headlines, and I knew the press would be all over this. Well, they took me downtown, they did the whole number, and no Martha Stewart, this is Lynn Stewart, you know. They didn't take me to the U.S. Attorney's Office and let me sign in. They took me, they put me in front of the camera, they handcuffed me, they fingerprinted me, and they put me in a cell to wait till I got to see the judge. Susan Tipograph, who was my lawyer at that point, came in the afternoon and showed me the indictment. And I must say, I really couldn't believe it. I was being indicted for doing what I believe any zealous advocate, any lawyer would do in any case such as the one I had been handling. In 1995, at the request of Ramsey Clark, I had taken on the defense of Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman. He was an Egyptian who had come to this country. He came as a cleric. He was an outstanding cleric. He was also an outstanding anti-American Islamist. He was a person who preached sermons that would literally curl your hair. But he thought he had a free pulpit here, that he could do that. He was turned in by an informant who basically was working for the Egyptian government. And while we give most of our money to Israel, we give the second most to Egypt. Because Egypt is also a cornerstone of that Middle East policy, which we are so shamed by every day. At any rate, I handled this case. My client, wrongfully I believe, was convicted by the testimony of this agent who had every reason to put him in jail since the Mubarak regime had been trying to arrest him forever. Uh-oh. No, he was anti-American. He's correcting me. He was certainly Egyptian, and he was certainly anti-Hosni Mubarak. But he also understood that that money that came from the Americans was definitely keeping Mubarak in power. And when he spoke, he basically pointed to his American audiences that they had better get on the American government and stop sending that money so Egypt could free themselves from this dictator who hadn't allowed an election in 40 years, except the ones he ran in by himself. Tell me about Saddam Hussein. What are you turning around and saying?
I stand corrected.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. Sometimes he corrects me, sometimes I correct him. It's 42 years of marriage. You know how that goes, right? Yes. At any rate, the subject of the indictment was that I had visited my client sometime in May of 2000. This is now 2002, 6 months after the World Trade Center. And that at that occasion I had made a press release on his behalf in contravention of prison regulations, but nonetheless something which I thought was part of the necessary legal representation to forward his cause. This case, which is based on a press release made openly to Reuters, it was no, secret thing like I stuck it in my bra strap and came out of the prison and snuck it away. This was publicly done, openly done. There was no secrecy connected with it. About a month later, I got a call from a U.S. attorney. He said, "You made a press release. You're not allowed to do it. The I said, "Yes." I said, "Well," and he said, "Well, we're going to review it, and we may have to sign you up again on the regulation. You can't see your client. You can't talk to him until we do that." Seemed to me a pretty de minimis thing. Seemed to me that was all there would be to it. How wrong I was, because in the meantime we had 9/11, and of course 9/11 changed everybody, and it certainly changed Washington. And John Ashcroft, on the day I was arrested, came to New York to ballyhoo the arrest of the terrorist lawyer, her interpreter, and her paralegal. He ballyhooed it as if, they were really fighting this war on terror. And I say to you that in all the arrests subsequent to that, every single one of them is treated the same way, as if this is a real inroad. But as David Cole has written, we're not safer and they're not better. They really have accomplished almost nothing with these arrests that they claim are anti-terrorist arrests. Because this is such a long saga, I hate to get hung up in it, but I think it's important that you understand what it really means. What it really means was they're sending a warning out to lawyers, to defense lawyers. They're saying to the lawyers, you defend your clients the way we tell you to, or else we'll come and get you, just like we did Lynn Stewart. Michael Ratner of the Center for Constitutional Rights said he was training lawyers for Guantanamo the day I was arrested. And they had to suspend the whole afternoon because these lawyers got so frightened by my arrest that they wanted to know how would they be protected, what could they do. Because this was a real situation where the crime of the client got folded over onto the lawyer. And of course, I have to say, I'm no goody two-shoes here. I'm a tough lawyer. I've fought the government on behalf of many people very unpopular, the Panthers, the Weather Underground, other various movement people, local people, like a young man named Larry Davis who wounded 6 policemen in his own self-defense but ended up alive and acquitted by a jury in the Bronx. But we went to trial, we lost. I ended up on sentencing day. The government said 30 years. Well, I'm 65. You know it's a death sentence, right? And I can tell you we organized the people, and I want to say this to you as an encouragement. You know, we keep saying, what can we do? What are we doing? How can we change things? First of all, I want to say, in the 50s, nobody saw the 60s coming. We didn't know the 60s were right around the corner. And maybe we didn't take advantage of them, but they happened. And I say to you, we don't know what's coming. We don't know that right around the corner. We know how they're prepared, but we have to be prepared when the moment comes to strike. At any rate, we organize people to write letters. We've got over 1,000 letters. We got letters from all sorts of sources that really are not thought of as being a source for a defense lawyer. A woman who had worked under Janet Reno in her Justice Department said, we knew all about this. We wouldn't indict on this. This is not what's considered materially aiding terrorism. And she went on to say very kind things about me as a lawyer. But the people who wrote, the little people, the thousands of people that I worked for during my career, the black grandmother who came in with her to tell me about her grandson. She didn't know if he really did it or not, but he needs a lawyer. And she would sit there with her little brown leather purse all folded up, and finally I would say, well, you know, I'm a private lawyer. You know, I have to get paid for my work. And as I said it, I knew whatever she had in that little brown purse, that was going to be all the fee I would ever get. But it was okay, because that's what I thought lawyering was about. And I miss it like crazy. And they took that. So when people suggest that, John, you, who wrote these torture memos, which empowered these evil men to do these evil deeds and to walk away scot-free, I say to myself, I'd like you to suffer in the same way I suffer. But I can also say to you that it has been a marvelous thing in the sense of the support I have gotten. Because you know, in April of 2002, most people had their head under a rock. They didn't want to step up to the plate. They didn't want the government to say, they're supporting terrorism. People stepped up. People wrote letters to this judge, and this judge finally gave me a sentence of 28 months. I want you to know I'm not guilty of anything. I really do not deserve to go to jail for 1 minute. But to the extent this was a thumb in the eye of the government, given by this judge, given by the people who rallied around me, this is something we can organize. We can do this. We can make a difference. So now we're on appeal. We're waiting for an answer. We're waiting, and we'll wait as long as we have to. I'm out. That's good. 6 years later, our bad news was that one of the 3 judges on the appeal panel who hears the case basically is George Bush's cousin. But yeah, you can't pick the judges. And as I said to the panel this morning, he displayed every genetic trait that we've come to expect from that family: arrogance, stupidity, but the other 2 judges are good. One of them was a dean of Yale Law School, but his name indicates, being of Italian origin, indicates to me he was not skull and bones, that's for sure. So anyway, we wait, we hope. We don't have a lot of faith in the system, but we still believe that things happen, and they happen for the good. So we ask everybody to stay tuned for that. I also want to say to you, and this, you're saying, well, she's jumping around for it, because I am. You know, I did the unthinkable. I booted up my computer this morning and got the latest news from both Democracy Now! And New York Times. And apparently a judge out in Iowa, is it, where they had the immigration raids, 56 people? The judge has decided these people will be punished as criminals and sent to prison for being illegal immigrants. This is a big jump up from where we were. It's one thing to instantly deport. It's another thing to put people in prison for coming to this country. And there were raids in all of California, I think, San Diego, LA, and San Francisco, 1,000 or more people arrested. So it's ongoing. It seems to never stop. It's not like they say, oh, let's take a break this weekend. Every day you pick up the paper, there is something else. And the only thing out there is us. Is we, my English teacher mother would say. And we better see to our business. Those patriots back in 1776, those abolitionists back in the 1850s, they saw to their business. They didn't relent. They didn't give up. And we can't either. So I adapt what was suggested at the last panel as the rallying cry. I said it reminded me, I think it's Henry II, where he gathers his men and makes this great speech about whatever else, you can always say you were at Ashcroft. Remember, whatever goes down in the next years, we were at Radford. We had a chance to hear the truth. Radford. Thank you.